A power more menacing than the H-bomb will be wielded by the first nation that learns how to use weather as a weapon, by Captain Howard T. Orville, United States Navy retired, as told to John Cord Lageman. Captain Orville charted the weather for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo and was a weather advisor for the North African invasion and for naval operations in the Pacific. He was appointed by President Eisenhower to serve as chairman of the Advisory Committee on Weather Control that submitted its report a few months ago. The subject on this article is a highly controversial one. Meteorologists and scientists differ widely as to when, how, and what degree we shall be able to control the weather, but there is no dispute over the view that weather control merits serious consideration and research. Imagine all North America turned into 1,000 dust bowls where no green things grows. Fierce winds blacken the sky with dust clouds. Great lakes recede into swamps. The mighty Mississippi dwindles to a string of muddy ponds. Or reverse the picture, Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities lie deep under the raging waters of the Great Lakes. The fruitful Mississippi Valley is one vast inland sea. Coastal cities from Boston to San Diego are ocean beds. These twin nightmares, with their concomitants of dying cities, disease, and famine, were the sober concern of a recent meeting of the Senate Military Preparedness Committee. On the stand was H-bomb physicist Dr. Edward Teller, who testified that the United States could be beaten without war if Russia was first to control the weather on a global scale. He wouldn't be surprised, Dr. Teller told the committee, if the Russians did achieve such control during the next 5 years, or if it took 50. Control of Earth's weather and temperature is within the realm of practicability now, says Dr. Joseph Kaplan, chairman of the International Geophysical Year. These and other scientists make it clear that weather control is a challenge to be faced in our lifetime. Used wisely, it could turn the Earth into a Garden of Eden. As a weapon, it could be more disastrous than nuclear warfare. How can we change the weather when we cannot as yet even predict it with 100% certainty? Although research on both fronts is interdependent, it is hard to say which may come first. Bear in mind that medical science can now prevent polio and cure pneumonia, while still unable to cope with the common cold. Cloud seeding, the first method that comes to mind for controlling weather, is of little importance because it is effective only in limited areas under favorable conditions. But present knowledge lists 7 possible ways of changing weather on a global scale. Rockets spread gas clouds to increase or decrease the amount of solar energy reaching the Earth. Electronic bombardment of the ionosphere to alter its electrical charge. Controlled thermonuclear reaction to heat great areas of the atmosphere. Reflectors on space platforms to concentrate the sun's rays on the Earth. Heat absorptive substances spread on the polar ice caps. Dye, oil or vegetation on ocean areas to alter their reflective properties. Chemicals on the ocean surface to effect evaporation and thus rainfall. All these methods would regulate the distribution of heat in different parts of the Earth's atmosphere. This is the basis of global weather control. Visualize the atmosphere as a tremendous solar battery, constantly being charged with 127 trillion horsepower of energy every day in the form of ultra-shortwave radiation from the sun. The upper atmosphere filters out some of the harmful rays, but most pass through with no effect. The Earth absorbs their energy, is warmed by part of it, and transmits the rest back to the atmosphere as heat. Because this heat is in the form of infrared rays of far longer wavelengths than sunlight, much of it is trapped by the atmosphere and stored in water vapor or clouds. But this action is not uniform. Some parts of the Earth absorb more sunlight and radiate far more heat than others. Ice and snow reflect most of the sun's energy back into space, where it is lost to Earth forever. Deserts, even the hottest ones, also bounce back most of it, but oceans and forests absorb the major part and pass it back to the atmosphere. This spotty action of the Earth's surface causes uneven accumulations of energy in the atmosphere. Wind and weather are the result, as this uneven heat distribution seeks equilibrium. What leverage can we exert in this gigantic weather mechanism? Can we never expect to control the sun, which is the source of all our heat? But new knowledge of the upper atmosphere, now being gained from rocket flights and satellites, may enable us to control the amount of solar energy that strikes the Earth. Air Force scientists are already experimenting with sodium vapor ejecting from jet planes to intercept solar radiation. Other gases would admit solar radiation but trap heat reflected back from Earth. The last half-century, during which we have burned huge amounts of fossil fuels, has shown what an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide can do. The amount spewed from chimneys and automobiles in 5 decades has created so-called greenhouse effect, which has raised the Earth's temperature by an estimated 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a significant rise. This so far accidental result is already serious, according to Dr. Kaplan, and we must find means to counteract it. Melting polar ice will make ocean levels rise at least 40 feet and inundate vast areas in the next 50 or 60 years, he warns, unless atmospheric temperatures are controlled. Electricity plays a part in determining our weather, high-altitude data already available suggests. Of particular interest is the ionosphere, that electrically charged outer layer of the atmosphere that reflects radio waves back to Earth beyond the horizon of the transmitter. This negatively charged shell can be thought of as one plate of a huge condenser. The other plate is the Earth's surface, which is positively charged in relation to the ionosphere, serving as conductors between the two plates, and so tending to neutralize their charge. Are ions, air molecules electrically charged by cosmic rays or by Earth radiations? An increase in the ion content of the lower layers of the atmosphere increases the electrical leakage between the ionosphere and Earth. During the last few years, ions created by hydrogen bomb explosions have done just this, lowered the electrical potential of the air near the ground. There is some evidence that this boost in ionization has resulted in more lightning activity. We may find other ways to manipulate the changes in Earth and sky and so affect the weather. One means might be an electronic beam to ionize or de-ionize the atmosphere over a given area. Controlled thermonuclear reaction may be a powerful instrument for effecting the heat balance in the atmosphere and so changing the weather. Enough heat to warm a city or even a continent is not beyond the realm of possibility. Once we succeed in releasing atomic energy from such plentiful forms of matter as seawater and granite, huge space platforms, which few doubt we will be able to put into the sky in the next decades, would make it possible to mount huge reflectors or lenses to focus the sun's rays at any desired spot on Earth. Such heat beams could warm other cities or set them on fire. Perhaps Senator Lyndon Johnson had this in mind when he told the assembled House and Senate recently, from space one can control the Earth's weather, cause drought and floods, change the tides and raise the levels of the sea, make temperate climates frigid. Changing the weather from outer space or with nuclear heat plants may seem more fantastic than these proposals really are. The space age has just begun. Our human imagination is still earthbound. For centuries, mankind has practiced a form of accidental and usually detrimental weather control by cutting down forests, draining lakes and swamps, and exhausting the fertility of farmlands. All these have increased the wasteful reflection of solar heat back into space, cut rainfall in some regions, and helped to create deserts like the Sahara. But there is a constructive hint in this. Change reflective properties of big surface areas and you influence the weather. Alaskan farmers even now add an extra 2 weeks to their short growing season by spreading lamp black on snow-covered fields and using sun reflectors to speed up melting. An untreated snow or ice field absorbs only 10 to 20% of the sun's rays. A blackened one absorbs 70 to 90%, melts faster, and warms the soil. New strains of cold-resistant cereal grasses are extending the green belt farther north in the subarctic regions of Russia and Alaska. This increases heat absorption, delays formation of a snow blanket in fall. Russia, having much territory in the subarctic, has carried cold weather farming much farther than we, because her major rivers flow northward and she is landlocked to the south. Russia has put tremendous effort into research on making frozen lands habitable and finding a sea outlet through ice-locked northern harbours. In such vast areas, the spreading of pigmented substances over ice fields, even by plane, can have little effect, but a heat-absorptive chemical fog spread over uninhabited ice fields by prevailing winds might someday make it possible to melt the polar ice cap. One result of that would be the sinking of our east coast cities beneath the Atlantic and the transformation of the Mississippi Valley into a huge inland sea. Water covers 2/3 of the Earth's surface. Altering its reflective properties would influence weather in various parts of the world. About half the heat energy absorbed by the oceans evaporates water that travels as clouds to pour rain on distant land areas. Seawater tagged with radioisotopes from H-bomb fallout has enabled us to learn that certain regions of the Earth get most of their rain from specific parts of the ocean. In the doldrum belt near the equator, steady evaporation of ocean water stores up tremendous accumulations of heat energy in the atmosphere, instead of dissipating itself in local and relatively harmless squalls. The tropical atmosphere becomes super-laden with energy until it releases its fury in a hurricane. Scientists believe that if we could break up the continuity of the reflective sea surface with patches of dye, floating islands of marine growth, or burning oil slicks, such a colossal overall buildup of energy could be avoided. Smaller concentrations would dissipate without harmful results. There are several chemicals which, when spread over the surface of water, drastically speed up or retard evaporation. A film of kettle alcohol, 1 molecule thick, for instance, substantially cuts down evaporation. Certain detergents speed up evaporation and cloud formation. Spread in large enough amounts, these chemicals could produce changes in the rainfall either to flood certain parts of the Earth or to turn them into deserts. The Russians may be ahead of us in weather control, and this worries our scientists even more than the technical problems involved. I shudder to think of the consequences of a prior Russian discovery of feasible weather control, says Dr. Henry Houghton of MIT. Unless we remain ahead of Russia in meteorology research, the prospects of international agreements on weather control will be poor indeed. An unfavorable modification of our climate in the guise of a peaceful effort to improve Russia's could seriously weaken our economy and ability to resist. We cannot trust to luck that we will be first to control the weather. The technical problems are staggering, and there is much research ahead before we can get results. It may be later than we think.
So what's being done right now? Well, there are some national geoengineering programs. The United Kingdom has one. China has one. The Gates Foundation is funding some research, a small team in the U.S. And there are people actually planning field experiments next year. There are modeling efforts which are pretty benign. They're fairly small scale. And very recently, the National Science Foundation in the U.S. funded a group, a team of research scientists led by Penn State, to look at climate responses across the board. Not just geoengineering, but they included geoengineering in the mix. As far as I know, the first such U.S.-funded research activity. So that's fairly new. And don't take my word for it. Listen to the World Economic Forum. Every year they put out a risk assessment. Just a couple of weeks ago they put out a risk assessment, and they listed 5 wild cards or X factors for the 21st century. Rogue geoengineering was one of those. This is The Economist and the business leaders worrying about somebody taking rogue action and just messing it up for everybody.
It's very important we communicate what we're doing to the public. We're very interested in making sure everyone knows what we're doing. We're not, we're a civilian space agency dedicated to science and research and so on. So we're very keen to make sure that the taxpayers know what we're doing and everything. So,
well, you know, when the article came out in the major newspapers, including the Huffington Post, there was no mention of lithium, not one. Not one mention of lithium until I heard the recording of the actual. I listened to it. I listened to the rockets go off. I had no idea there was going to be a lithium dispersed until I heard payload lithium dispersed.
Right, there was lithium dispersed, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. I think you might be under some misconceptions about what we're doing, but I'm happy to tell you any details that you need.
Well, I know that it says in your article that you're doing it for communications.
Okay, I'm happy to talk to you more about it. There are many reasons we're doing it.
Okay.
we don't understand how the wind in the upper atmosphere moves.
Mm-hmm.
In these chemtrails, there's different kinds of chemtrails, as you probably know. Different trails at night we use and different trails during the day. The wind blows them around. They glow either on their own or from scattered sunlight. We take pictures and we can see how the wind trail moves around and use that to infer what the wind is. Just like if you were taking a picture of an airplane contrail, you can use that to see how the wind was blowing up at those altitudes. This is much higher altitude, so we use these chemical trails.
And what is the purpose of knowing what the wind's going to do in the ionosphere?
The purpose is the ionosphere is really to understand our planet. It's very fundamental science. We're trying to understand every day. We know there's electric currents that flow over the head. They're just naturally there. They've been there for ever since the Earth had an atmosphere and a magnetic field. And the wind is driven by the sun. The sun heats the atmosphere. The wind blows, and every day that wind drives an electric current. And we're trying to understand what causes that. Essentially, how does it work in detail? And also importantly, when the sun becomes active with lots of sunspots and lots of magnetic activity, that changes the wind pattern and changes the electric current. So we want to understand both what it is on a regular day when there's no solar activity, and then what it is when there's a lot of solar activity.
Is there some other kind of a way that you can use it without dispersing the lithium?
We're researching other ways. The lithium is actually harmless to the environment, and we could show you more about that. But it is tricky to use because it's very faint. You can't see it with your naked eye. You have to, have special cameras to see it and so on. So we don't like to use it for that reason. It's hard. In other words, it's hard measurement to make. We're researching other ways to put sensors directly on the rocket to measure the wind, and those are ongoing. We're trying to develop those now. In fact, one of the purposes of this mission was to do that.
Okay. Well, you've explained it to me then. I don't agree with it, but I appreciate you explaining it to me.
Email too if you have detailed questions, anything you want.
Okay, I will. I'm gonna research it a little more, and I will email you. And I appreciate you taking the time out to speak to me today, sir.
Get your call. It's not often we get to hear from members of the public and people who are really interested and concerned with what we're doing. And I really appreciate your time.
I wish more people would call. I really do. I've called my senators. I've called my governor. You can't get through to anyone, sir. You can't get through to anybody.
Yeah.
I go to my city council. I live in rural North Carolina. They don't care. They laugh you out of there. There's no other recourse for us, sir, unless to talk to people directly and find out what is going on, because we're paying for it.
Well, I don't know how far you are from Walls Flight Facility. Is that easy? Is that drivable from where you are?
Where is it, sir? I don't know where it is.
It's north of Norfolk, Virginia. It's on the eastern shore of Virginia. If you're at Norfolk, it would probably take you another 2.5 hours to get there.
Uh-huh.
So if you're in North Carolina, I don't know where you are, but maybe.
Right. Yeah, I'm in western rural North Carolina near the Tennessee border.
Have a chance. You might consider either going to Goddard Space Flight Facility, which is outside of D.C. There is Clemson University, which is where all the chemical release work is done.
Oh, really? Well, that's very close to me.
You might contact those guys. I'm sure they'd be happy to explain what they're doing.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, I will do that. Just ask for the science department.
Well, I don't know what department they're in, but Larson, Larsen, Miguel Larsen is the lead, and he's been doing this for decades and can explain in detail what they're doing and why it's not an issue for people living. We wouldn't, we would be, as a government agency, we would not be allowed, to do anything that would be harmful. So he's under strict controls and that sort of thing. So he can explain it to you. He can even show you around, that sort of thing.
Okay, and you said his name was Miguel Larsen with an L?
Larsen.
Okay, at Clemson. Okay, well, thank you so much, Mr. Rowland. I appreciate all of your information.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
These are conditions you have to have. These have to be present in order to form a persistent contrail. So, and that's actually hardly ever the case. You need to have certain conditions. One of which you have to be an airplane above 30,000 feet. The temperature has to be below 40 degrees centigrade, and you have to have a relative humidity of 67%. You cannot see a contrail which is from the whole spectrum of the horizon. You see contrails just persistent there of different altitudes. That's physically is impossible. So in that sense, that's science. It's physics. So there must be another reason for it that it's there. They officially admitted that they're doing it. I mean, geoengineering programs, they are on for decades. They did it in the Vietnam War. It's there. And they also admitting it that they're doing this now, right now, as we speak. I mean, the official narrative is that they do this in order to stop global warming. So the geoengineering programs are there to protect us against global warming. That's the official narrative, and that's why they spray the atmosphere full with all these heavy metals and all to reflect sunlight, solar radiation management. That's the purpose. That's why they spray. For instance, in 2009, they already stated that they want to spray 20 million tons of aluminium nanoparticles.
That's right.
In the atmosphere. That's officially, so it's not like a conspiracy or whatever. It's a very, very multi-layered operation and programs. It's very difficult to see exactly what is going on. There are numerous ways of doing it, in the spraying or in solar radiation management or in the ionosphere heaters. It's a multi-layered programming. So there's not one method how they do it. They're spraying with different chemicals, visibly or non-visible. So it's not one method. It's commercial and it's military. So you have military spraying aircraft, tanker aircraft who do spraying, but you also have commercial aircraft who are doing it. I think certain airliners are involved in it. They are aware and they are paid for it to be involved in it. And then you have the commercial airlines. A lot of commercial airlines, they are not aware of it because it's also part of the fuel policies. So it's done as additives in the fuel. That's the thing. Another thing is that in the commercial aviation, the policy of fuel it's more and more merged into a single fuel policy. So there are not really a lot of different producers of kerosene or fuel. There's maybe only one producer of the fuel, so it's easier to add it in the fuel. But and they make use of very bad quality fuel as well. They change to bad quality fuel. So that's also an element of the fact that you see more of this going on.
Connection has been the aluminum in the vaccines. I wrote several articles about the effect of the adjuvants in vaccines, including the mercury and the aluminum effect. Then I found some articles about the chemtrails, and there was a lot being said about it, and I wasn't too sure whether it was true or not, because in my state we rarely saw them. But as I started looking on the internet, and I would see these states in which there were these crisscross patterns, and they were very tight patterns, and these geometrical shapes, where it was obviously it was a purposeful covering of the atmosphere with these patterns. And the trails were so long. Well, now we're starting to see them in my state, and as I look at them, they go from horizon to horizon. Well, I've been alive long enough to know that jets never did that in the past. And I see the same patterning effect now where they're crisscrossing. It's an obvious pattern. And so I looked into the literature and some of the reports and YouTube videos, and they were saying that they were dropping one of the ingredients was aluminum. Well, I had done a fair amount of writing and research on the effect of aerosolized chemicals in the nose when you breathe them. And what we knew was that these particles tend to travel along the olfactory nerves, which are the smell nerves in the nose, and it travels directly to the part of the brain that has to do with memory and emotions, the hippocampus, the entorhinal area, and the prefrontal cortex, and that you can trace these chemicals traveling along that nerve and depositing in this area of the brain. The other thing that was known is that if you aerosolize aluminum, it's one of the metals that passes very easily along this track and directly into the brain, so it bypasses the blood-brain barrier and goes directly into the brain and accumulates. Well, if you do it in animals, it produces lesions or damage in that area of the brain, and the animal will begin to show changes of memory and learning and emotional changes. critical area of the brain. The worst of all is the nanosize. Now, nanosize means you make it such a small particle that it easily penetrates skin, it penetrates barriers in the body that normally metals cannot pass through. When you nanosize and produce these incredibly small particulate matter, it passes very easily. So when you nanosize aluminum and you use it in these aerosols through the nasal passages, it enters the brain in very high concentrations. And they find that the nano-sized aluminum in the brain is infinitely more toxic. Now, one of the toxic reactions to aluminum is intense inflammation and activation of cells in the brain that are the immune cells called microglia. Aluminum is a very potent activator of these immune cells, and that triggers the release of a powerful substance called glutamate, which is an excitotoxin. It causes cells to die from an excitatory mechanism, kind of complex mechanism, but it is a combination of inflammation and excitotoxicity. And I coined the term in the medical literature called immunoexcitotoxicity to describe that process. So we know that occurs. We know it occurs very easily. Now, the reports are coming out now that what they're spraying is nano-sized aluminum, and the idea is the whole concept of preventing global warming. And they nano-size the aluminum so it'll stay in the upper atmosphere longer, supposedly as a reflective compound, metal. The problem with that, even from a climatologic description, is that if you make it into cirrus-like clouds rather than reflecting it upward and out of the atmosphere, it reflects the heat downward and actually causes global warming. So you could envision that they're doing this on purpose to make the atmosphere heat up so they can see the atmosphere is warming up. But what I'm concerned about mainly is the medical effect, and that's because of this very strong connection between aluminum passing through this pathway into the brain is so strongly connected with Alzheimer's disease and other diseases of memory. If you're aerosolizing this and spraying literally tons of it over the world, and people are constantly breathing that aerosolized nano-sized aluminum, which will easily penetrate filters in your air-conditioned system, enter your home. So you're breathing it 24 hours a day, producing high levels of aluminum in this part of the brain, and the consequences could be absolutely devastating. Could cause a huge increase in Alzheimer's disease and inflammatory neurological disorders. Now, I watched YouTube, which was a Geo-Engineering conference that the government had put on. And in the conference, one of the questions somebody in the audience asked, well, what is the medical effect of spraying aluminum in the atmosphere? And the speaker said, well, we don't really know, but we're in the process of researching that. Well, of course, that was an absolute lie. We do know what it does.
Right.
But the fact that they were admitting that, in fact, they were going to spray, they gave it in the future tense, that they were going to spray aluminum. The evidence now from the examination by biologists and scientists around the world is that the aluminum level in the lakes and streams and trees is increasing enormously. Some areas have incredible elevations of aluminum in the groundwater and in the vegetation. So if this indeed is happening, we're looking at a medical catastrophe that's worldwide.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Thank you very much. I'm Richard Jordan, chairman of the conference. I'm going to just introduce Khalid Dawood, who will introduce the speakers. So Khalid, thank you very much for moderating this session, and I turn it over to you, and I will return in about 3 minutes.
So our next speaker is Dr. Rosalind Peterson. She's the California president and co-founder of the Agriculture Defense Coalition, formed in 2006 to protect agricultural crop production from uncontrolled experimental weather modification programs. A very interesting topic, you know, for a non-specialized person like myself. But also very interesting in her CV that we have with you is also her extensive efforts to protect drinking water supplies from toxic chemical contamination in Martinez, California. That's a very interesting topic, of course, and I was actually wondering myself whether you can tackle whether the same experiments that you're holding in California could be extended to other world countries, particularly poor and developed countries like where we come from. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. It is a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you today. One of the things that I would like to say is that we are in a global drumbeat right at the moment talking about climate change and global warming. One of the things that is affected by climate change is agriculture. But some of what we are seeing is man-made, but man-made in a different way than you may guess. Weather modification programs, experimental ones done by private companies, done by the United States government, done by states across the United States, are underway. There's more than 50 of them in operation across the United States. All of these impact agriculture because they change the microclimates needed for agriculture to survive. None of these programs that I know of today, and this is all public record, are available at any time with oversight, agricultural oversight or public oversight. These programs impact agriculture, and there are programs around the world, international corporations are modifying our weather all the time, and they're modifying it in ways that cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Most of it is chemically altered, so that what happens is that we are putting chemicals, ground-based chemicals that are shot into the air, or chemicals coming from airplanes that change and modify our weather. So one of the things that I'm concerned about and that we need to address in the future is how these programs are impacting microclimates needed for our crops to survive and needed for pollination. If we change the growing season, the pollinators may not survive, and also our crops, our flowers, and our tree crops may not get the pollination needed. So one of my areas is looking at this situation to see if we can begin to put under control experimental and other types of weather modification programs. The other issue is that a lot of times we're talking about mitigation for climate change. It's rather an undefined term at this period of time. And so what happens is that many times we're talking about artificially putting chemicals like sulfur or particulates into the atmosphere in what they call geoengineering schemes to reduce and help the planet, supposedly, but help the planet to not go through such a tremendous global climate change and to mitigate global warming. However, the incidence of putting chemicals into our atmosphere is going to change and impact agricultural crop production. And if you take and you put up into our skies chemicals to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the earth, you are going to begin to reduce crop production. Studies at the University of Illinois on corn crop production show reductions. Without the process of photosynthesis, whereby plants from direct sunlight gain the energy to grow, to produce crops, we are going to find ourselves, if we mitigate in that direction, impacting the crop production not only here in the United States, but worldwide. One of the things that is impacting crop production right now in the United States and reducing photosynthesis and also impacting the ability of solar power panels to generate the type of power that they should is persistent jet contrails. NASA talks about persistent jet contrails as exacerbating global warming because they trap warmth in the atmosphere when they produce cirrus and man-made clouds. NASA also talks about that that these aircraft leaving persistent contrails are changing our climate. And when they change our climate to the degree that one jet can leave a persistent jet contrail which will spread across our skies from what this picture up here on my left on the screen looks like, which is a trail left by a jet, that trail can expand to 4,000 kilometers and last for 20 hours. This was unheard of in the early 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't until the late 1980s that there was a change and we started to have persistent jet contrails that persist. NASA studies show that part of our global warming problem could be attributed to these types of contrails and the jets that leave them. So one of the issues as we go through is, how do you like your skies, natural or man-made? And right now we are making man-made clouds, and this is trapping warmth in our atmosphere. The climate change that is produced by these jets, not all jets, mostly some non-commercial, but what happens to our skies is that we start to see the changes. The man-made clouds do trap the warmth, and they increase the humidity. This allows for pests to proliferate, diseases, molds, mildews, funguses, and viruses. This is a man-made cloud, ladies and gentlemen, and these pictures I took myself over Northern California, and this is a burst. This is where a jet left a huge plume, and then this turned in at the end of it to a burst, and this is not normal, never seen before in our county historically, and I was born and raised there. This is another picture showing the jet trail just before the burst. This is our skies, and I want you to know that what you're seeing now, a lot of times many scientists know, especially at NASA and in other areas, that the skies that we're seeing are not normal cloud formations. These are man-made. And what happens as we reduce the amount of sunlight in a form of global dimming, we reduce the solar power with these type of clouds, and we reduce photosynthesis, which is going to impact agriculture. The pictures look odd. The formations don't look like normal clouds that people have seen before historically. This is another type of man-made cloud, and what we have done and what you're seeing here is we have the photographs from the times that the jet leaves the first trail as a thin, spindly trail to where they form into these different types of cloud formations. All of you can start looking up and seeing this. What happens is that there are experiments, and there's a color, you can see some color in this photograph. And part of what we're doing also is we're sending up canisters. The United States government, NASA, the U.S. Air Force, is sending up canisters into the atmosphere filled with chemicals to modify and experiment with our ionosphere. And when we modify and experiment with our ionosphere up here, we create experiments which they can see through these persistent jet contrails as they stay in the sky for long periods of time, and they can watch the experiments. The type of chemicals they are using are aluminum, barium, strontium, and these canisters are sent up on rockets, and what they do is they superheat the canisters to create experiments in our atmosphere. The experiments can give you colorful auroras, which they talk about as being wonderful. Many times people think that the auroras in Alaska and the ones we see are normal, but there's beginning to be more and more seen across the United States and elsewhere where aluminum, trimethyl aluminum experiments to make clouds are beginning to impact us. The reason I am concerned for agriculture is that none of these experiments have any public oversight nor agricultural oversight. Our drinking water is impacted because the chemicals are now beginning to show up in our drinking water. In California, the State Department of Health drinking water tests were examined between 1970 and this year, and we found unusual spiking in barium, aluminum, strontium, magnesium, calcium, manganese, and all of these spiked at the same time in various drinking water supplies across the state of California and also in Arizona. So what's happening with these atmospheric tests is that aluminum, as one example, gets into, with increased pollution and acid rain, gets into the root systems of our crop trees and our trees, and it looks like the trees are dying of drought. But they're not. What happens is that the root systems can no longer absorb the water and the nutrients needed to survive. Many of our forests in Redding, California and other areas are dying. The oak trees, the redwood trees, the Douglas fir across the United States, many areas. We believe that these trees are impacted because they cannot absorb enough water because aluminum is going into their root systems. Also, molds, mildew, and fungus from warmer temperatures produced by persistent jet contrails are also allowing pests and molds to proliferate, also impacting tree health and crop health. The skies that you see up here, it is important to note, have a white haze to them. When crossing the United States 2 days ago, we saw this man-made produced haze all the way across the United States. There were a few real clouds. We saw the persistent jet contrails from the jet windows, and the skies in the white haze looked a lot like this. So one of the things that we need to really look at is that jet fuel emissions contaminate our air, much as automobile exhaust. They know from scientific studies back in the 1970s that they deplete beneficial ozone in the atmosphere by releasing nitric acid. So one of the things that we need to look at is the impact of just jet fuel and just the emissions from jets as well. I want to go on and talk briefly about a couple of issues here that I think are important for everyone to realize. If we don't look at the problems that we are creating, the atmospheric testing programs, in other words, the jet contrails that are warming our climate, and we say to ourselves, we want to geo-engineer something else. We want to add more particulates to help global warming or to stop climate change. What we're going to have is we're going to have a pea soup up there of chemicals which are going to be detrimental to our health. It is much better to take the EPA model of the 1970s, where the Environmental Protection Agency was designed to put in regulations to reduce the pollution at its source, to reduce and put caps on how much pollution corporations, cars, automobiles were putting into the atmosphere. One of the things that we're talking about as mitigation is to go into geoengineering plans which add more chemicals to our atmosphere, which are going to get into our drinking water supplies, which are going to get into our soils, which are going to impact our trees. Our trees across the United States, many of them in many areas, especially Mendocino, Lake, and Sonoma County, are dying. They are not healthy as they used to be. And this problem, having traveled across the United States into some other areas, seeing the pictures coming in from across the United States and other countries, we're finding that there's beginning to be an impact from all of these programs and all the chemicals in our skies. And so one of the things we need to think about and work for is reducing pollution. Alan Buckman from the California State Department in Fish and Game talked about microbes, and they're important to the environment. We have at our disposal already some technologies and already the wherewithal to begin to make the planet more healthy and to put it into a different perspective. But if we go to the geoengineering schemes that are waiting in the wings, thousands of them, to put the particulates up and sulfur, then we are going to be in trouble with agriculture across the United States and around the world. It is time that we look at some different solutions that are already here, and it's time that we look at what's happening in our skies and say we don't need to add any more chemicals, we are doing enough. And what these experiments in our skies are doing with atmospheric heating and testing, we don't know, but the chemicals are showing up in our drinking water. So in closing, I would like to say to all of you and to encourage you to know that just what I showed you today is beginning to impact crop production in the United States. And we're seeing higher UV radiation that is burning the tips of our trees and our plants. We see the molds and mildews growing here, and we see all of this, and we hope that all of you will consider before you think of mitigation and just go forward with some of the plans that are being sold to you as almost a cap-and-trade situation, where a corporation like Planktos decides to put iron dust into the Galapagos Islands area. This is a proposal, may have already started, and to create algae blooms. And yes, they're saying, yes, we're going to help the environment because we're going to create these algae blooms for more oxygen. But what happens is it's going to impact the marine life in those areas. As a geoengineering plan, it is going to be sold, the credits for this, the supposed benefits, is to be sold as credits to people who want to pollute more. And here's the really awful twist to this, in my opinion, is if we sell pollution credits to polluters to ask them so that they can pollute more, we're only going to add more to our climate change and to our global warming processes. We have to say, no, we don't want money market schemes that are going to go into the ocean and change something possibly to the detriment of our oceans or our air, in order to sell credits to someone who wants to pollute more. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a consideration for all of you when you start to talk about caps and trades, when you start to talk about geoengineering plans, because we don't need a money market scheme. We need to have and use the microbes available to us, the science available to us to reduce the pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere, and we need a new direction, and I think that this might be a good one. So I hope that all of you will consider what I have to say today, and I want to thank you once again for listening to what I had to say.
Thank you.
The Nuremberg Principles were a set of guidelines for determining what constitutes a war crime. The document was created by the International Law Commission of the United Nations to codify the legal principles underlying the Nuremberg trials of Nazi Party members following World War II. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. This latter element requires that before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the experimental subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it is to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. The duty and responsibility of ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. The experiment should be such as to yield fruitful results for the good of society, unprocurable by other methods or means of study, and not random and unnecessary in nature. The experiment should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problem under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. The experiment should be conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. No experiment should be conducted where there is a prior reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except, perhaps, in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by the humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by the experiment. Proper preparations should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. The experiment should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The highest degree of skill and care should be required through all stages of the experiment of those who conduct or engage in the experiment. During the course of the experiment, the human subject should be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seems to him to be impossible. During the course of the experiment, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage, if he has probably cause to believe in the exercise of the good faith, superior skill and careful judgment required of him that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to the experimental subject. On the 10th of December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted and proclaimed the United Declaration of Human Rights, the full text of which appears in the following pages. Following this historic act, the Assembly called upon all member countries to publicize the text of the Declaration and to cause it to be disseminated, displayed, read, and expounded principally in schools and other educational institutions, without distinction based on the political status of countries or territories, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt of human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, whereas it is essential, if man is not compelled to have recourse, as a last resort, to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law, whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations, whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, whereas a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge. Now therefore the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. Article 1. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. Article 3. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 4. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 6. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Article 7. All are equal before the law, and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement of such discrimination. Article 8. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by the Constitution or by law. Article 9. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Article 10. Everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his rights and obligations and of any criminal charge against him. Article 11. Number 1. Everyone charged with a penal offence has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to law in a public trial at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defence. Number 2. No one shall be held guilty of any penal offence on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offence under national or international law at the time when it was committed, nor shall a heavier penalty be imposed than the one that was applicable at the time the penal offence was committed. Article 12. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honour and reputation. Everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Article 13, Number 1. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Number 2. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Article 14, Number 1. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Number 2. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Article 15, Number 1. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Number 2. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality. Article 16, Number 1. Men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. Number 2. Marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses. Number 3. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. Article 17, Number 1. Everyone has the right to own property, alone as well as in association with others. Number 2. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Article 18. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in a community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Article 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Article 20, Number 1. Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Number 2. No one may be compelled to belong to an association. Article 21, Number 1. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. Number 2. Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in his country. Number 3. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. Article 22. Everyone, as a member of society, has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state, of the economic, social and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. Article 23, Number 1. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Number 2. Everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. Number 3. Everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity, and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Number 4. Everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests. Article 24. Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays and with pay. Article 25, Number 1. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Number 2. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. Article 26, Number 1. Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Number 2. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Number 3. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Article 27, Number 1. Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Number 2. Everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. Article 28. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Article 29, Number 1. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Number 2. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. Number 3. These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Article 30. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein.